Welcome to Insanity Fair. It's June 2020 and everybody is talking about statues. So I thought I'd do this video about the most famous statue in the world, the Statue of Liberty in New York, and explain why that statue too is in fact a racist symbol. And to do that we'll need to talk about the history of the statue itself and about what it meant to people at the time. Now, as everybody knows, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from the French people to the American people, and it was meant to represent the partnership between the two great revolutionary democratic countries. And what's not generally appreciated is that the theme that was chosen for this great symbolic gift was the emancipation of the slaves. And so Lady Liberty, as she's now known, has at her feet a chain with a broken shackle. And the French, the idealistic French, who organised and executed the statue, believed that this was the great symbol of American liberty, the freeing of the slaves. Now, they didn't really understand what that meant, I think. And also the thing is that it took 10 years from the first idea of it to design, manufacture, raise the money, and send it all to America, and then build the plinth and everything. It was a huge endeavour, and this all happened in the aftermath of the Civil War. And the Americans were seeing the results of the emancipation of the slaves. Now, what you have to understand is that the Civil War was not about freeing the slaves. It's a little bit like the Second World War. Lots of people justify the Second World War because they say, oh, you know, look what Hitler was doing to the Jews. And that is true, but nobody went to war because of the Jews, because of protecting the Jews. It was something that they found out only at the end when they came across the concentration camps. There were rumours, obviously. Now, freeing the slaves was slightly different, but Abraham Lincoln, the president during the Civil War, said repeatedly that he did not go to war to free the slaves. And that was not his concern. His concern was saving the Union. And there were various factors, various political factors. One was that the number of states was increasing because there were new territories which had been settled in the Great Plains. And so the question was whether these were going to be slave states or free states, as they were called. The states which didn't have legal slavery were called free states. But the thing is that in the free states, it's not that they were all run by, Nelson Mandela. A lot of them had laws saying that black people weren't allowed at all in the territory of the state. And where they were allowed, there were all kinds of restrictions on them. And even when Lincoln was proposing emancipation of the slaves, he said, of course, they won't be allowed to marry white people and they won't be able to vote. And, that was the spirit of the time. It was assumed by everybody that black people were going to be junior partners. However, Lincoln, the lawyer, did insist that the constitutional rights of black people as Americans should be the same. And that was a history-making decision, to give him his due. However, you see what they thought. Yes, also you see it was an economic decision. The Confederacy relied on slaves for its economy, and so by emancipating the slaves, Lincoln was aiming to cripple the Confederacy economically, which largely happened, in fact. And also the issue of slavery during the war became progressively more of a rallying cry. And there was, of course, a moral element to it, not just in the United States but around the world. So Lincoln could see which way the wind was blowing. However, there was a big problem because they didn't know what was going to happen when with the slaves that were freed, because there were about 4 million slaves. Population was 31 million. And so this was clearly a large-scale problem, millions of freed slaves. In Brazil, which was, roughly similar, there was a roughly similar situation in that there was a system of plantation slavery. And when they emancipated their slaves, they just turned them out of doors. They just said, "Okay, you're free. Go and be free somewhere." And so this meant that they congregated in these shanty towns, living in absolute poverty and deprivation, which are still there. The shanty towns are still there, although the population is now. Brazil has such a mixed population. It's not just a black and white issue. But you can see that's similar dynamic. Now, the solution that they had, the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, and the one that was generally accepted among sort of progressive intellectuals, I suppose you'd say, at the time, was that the slaves were all going to leave. That once they'd been freed from their slavery, they wouldn't want to stay, so they would go to they'd go somewhere. And Africa was what they thought. Well, they thought, they're from Africa, they'll want to go back there. And so Liberia was set up. The country in West Africa, Liberia, was set up as a home for the slaves, and a few did go. But the thing is that this was just a stupid idea. What were they going to do? Round them up by force? They couldn't do that, and they just assumed. They made it was wishful thinking, of course. Hitler actually had a similar idea about the Jews originally, that they would all be quite happy to leave Central Europe, Austria, Germany. And they didn't, the blacks, the slaves, the freed slaves. Very few of them wanted to leave. There is still an elite of former slaves in Liberia called the Americans, who are a sort of social elite there. But it's, that's a peripheral phenomenon. What happened was that some of them decided to stay where they were because, they were born and bred there. They had family, and so some of them stayed and became rural workers or domestic servants or, whatever, working in the various activities in the south. But a lot of them decided that they were going to go north, which was a reasonable thing to do because these were their liberators. And so they flocked to the northern cities, which had a different kind of economy, because the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. So there were factories setting up, and there was a lot of manual work available. And so a black urban working class was created out of nothing. Now, you've got to remember that these are the same states which had had laws before the Civil War saying that no black people were allowed in at all, and suddenly they found that there was this black working class, and they didn't like it. Now, this period in American history is called by historians the most corrupt period ever. And what happened was that the Republican Party developed a strategy of putting up black leaders who were uneducated black people. It wasn't their fault. I mean, slaves did not have education. And they said, okay, now you're in charge of this district. And plied them with drink and kept them going, while the real business was done by the party bosses, the white party bosses who collected bribes around the back in the famous smoke-filled rooms. But this did mean that the blacks, the newly freed slaves, were under some kind of political cover and legal protection. And so, the problem was then came. A new problem presented itself. What were they going to? What were you going to do about this? Because, they didn't like the idea of having a black working class. It created the conditions for a kind of apartheid, which continued in America up until the 1960s. The Jim Crow laws and practices. But anyway, they came up with a brilliant solution. Another brilliant solution. Now, this time they weren't going to get the slaves out, they were going to get white people in. Now, we think of America as being a country of immigration, but actually in the 19th century this wasn't true. The number of foreign-born Americans was the percentage was in single figures. 3% of one census, I don't remember the date. And so they decided that they were going to promote white immigration. Now, this is something that lots of people have done, but it's sort of disappeared from historical memory. Australia, for example, had a Keep Australia White policy, because Australia was a country of massive immigration. And it was considered perfectly reasonable to say, oh, we want to have white people. We're a European... a country of European immigrants, and we want to keep it like that. Also, of course, Australia had a particularly vicious racism against the indigenous population, the blackfellas, as they were still called. So, I think now you can guess where the Statue of Liberty comes into this. So they set up this massive program for white immigration. And so that meant that New York was the natural point of entry. And they set up this huge system for processing people. Telephone. Right, sorry about that, telephone. Where were we? Now, yes, the idea of a racist immigration policy in America is one that we all do know about already, in fact, because the famous policy against Chinese on the West Coast particularly, it affected the West Coast because that's where they came in from the Pacific, was, I think, it's something that was more acceptable. I mean, it still is, in fact, in force. A lot of countries have special restrictions on Chinese just because there are so many of them. And so the policy is not exactly racist in the same way, but in effect, yeah, it was a racist policy. The yellow race was despised, as they used to call it. But everybody's forgotten, you see, that the idea of the "bring me all your huddled masses" was "bring me all your huddled masses as long as they are white," and they didn't really need to enforce this in any way because the numbers of potential black immigrants was tiny. I mean, I don't know if there was any actual prohibition, but if you were taking in immigrants from Europe, then they were going to be white at that time. And so the Statue of Liberty was essentially repurposed from being a monument to the emancipation of the slaves. It was basically welcome to America, white people. And as she, stands there with her torch aloft, you can see that it's an immensely powerful symbol. I mean, if you visit, I'd recommend the boat trip, because you go around the base of it, and it's a very authentic experience. You're in a crowded boat with mostly foreign tourists. I mean, non-American tourists. There are some Americans. And as you go around the base of the statue and you look up, it's an awe-inspiring sight. Awesome is a word that's overused these days, but it really is awe-inspiring. And the impression it must have made on people was extraordinary. And they saw it as a symbol of liberty, which it is, of course. But basically what she's saying, holding the torch up, is saying, white people this way. Anyway, just as a little postscript, something else which people don't know, I didn't know. Somebody locally told me that, because I'm living in France, in the Côte d'Or département, and the capital is Dijon. And the engineering for the Statue of Liberty was done in Dijon. And the company that did the heavy engineering was an enterprise called Gadget, Gadget, Gadget. And when they had the unveiling, it was a huge event in New York, the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty, because there'd been a public subscription raised to pay for it, and it had really caught people's imagination. And so there were massive crowds. There was, I think, the first ticker tape parade, and things like that. And so the company that had made the statue decided to use it for some publicity. And so they made little models of the Statue of Liberty, and they gave them away as keepsakes, or sold them. I don't know, actually. Maybe sold them, maybe gave them away. And the little statues of the Statue of Liberty became hot items, because everybody wanted to have a keepsake, a souvenir of this great event. And so the Statue of Liberty said along the bottom, Gadget, but obviously English-speaking people pronounce that gadget, and so they said, have you got your gadget? Oh, I must get my gadget. And that is how the word gadget arrived in the English language. Thank you.